The train whistle screamed across the Arizona desert like a wounded animal, announcing another load of dreamers to Copper Falls. Among the passengers stepping onto the weathered platform that November morning in 1885 was a young woman clutching a carpetbag and a letter worn soft from reading. Rebecca Thompson had traveled 800 miles based on promises written in careful script, but the man waiting for her took one look at her calloused hands and turned his back forever. What happened next would shake the foundations of everything this frontier town thought it knew about love, survival, and the courage it takes to build a life from nothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Desert Valley Railroad Depot squatted in the Arizona sun like a wooden box left to bleach. Its paint had surrendered years ago to wind and sand, leaving behind boards the color of old bones. Rebecca Thompson stepped down from the passenger car, her worn traveling dress catching the desert breeze that carried the smell of sage and copper dust. She was 23, with auburn hair pinned back in a practical bun and green eyes that had learned to observe before speaking. Her hands, hidden beneath cotton gloves, told stories of wheat harvests and barn raisings, of soil worked until it yielded its secrets. The letter in her reticule had been read so many times the folds threatened to tear. William Hartwell had written with confidence about his expanding ranch, his need for a refined woman to grace his home, his desire for children to carry on his name. His penmanship was elegant, his words carefully chosen. What he had not mentioned, and what Rebecca had not volunteered, was the nature of her upbringing. The photographs she had sent showed her in her only good dress, hands positioned to hide the permanent stains beneath her fingernails. The letters she had written spoke of household management and Christian values, but said nothing of the years spent behind a plow, or the way she could judge rainfall by the smell of the wind. Copper Falls stretched before her like a mirage made real. The main street ran straight as a rifle shot between buildings that looked hastily constructed and permanently temporary. The Miner's Supply occupied the largest storefront, its windows displaying picks and shovels alongside bolts of calico. Next door, the Kellner boarding house advertised clean rooms and hot meals in faded letters across its false front. At the far end of the street, the Copper Falls saloon leaked piano music and laughter into the afternoon air. Everything was coated in a fine layer of red dust that spoke of dry seasons and harder times. William Hartwell was easy to spot. He stood beside a gleaming black buggy, dressed in a coat that cost more than most men earned in a season. His mustache was waxed to sharp points, and his boots reflected the desert sun like mirrors. At 38, he carried himself with the bearing of a man accustomed to having his wishes become reality. He owned the largest ranch in 3 counties, employed 40 men, and had built a house that towered over the landscape like a monument to his own success. What he wanted now was a wife who would complement his achievements, a woman whose refinement would reflect his prosperity. Rebecca approached with measured steps, her carpetbag held carefully to avoid wrinkles in her dress. She had practiced this moment during the long train ride, rehearsing words that would bridge the gap between expectation and reality. But when William Hartwell looked up from his pocket watch and saw her walking toward him, his expression shifted almost imperceptibly. His eyes traveled from her face to her posture to her hands, cataloging details with the efficiency of a man accustomed to evaluating livestock. "Miss Thompson," his voice carried the crisp authority of education and money. "I trust your journey was comfortable." She curtsied slightly, grateful for the hours her mother had spent teaching proper manners before consumption claimed her. "Mr. Hartwell, thank you for your kindness in meeting me." He nodded and gestured toward the buggy, but his movements had lost their earlier eagerness. As he helped her up to the seat, his fingers brushed her gloves, and she saw him pause. The fabric was thin from washing, and beneath it her hands felt different than he had expected. Too firm, too knowing. The ride to his ranch passed in increasingly uncomfortable silence. The landscape rolled away in waves of red earth and scattered juniper, beautiful in its harshness but unforgiving to those who misunderstood its demands. Rebecca found herself studying the soil, noting the drainage patterns and the way certain plants clustered where underground water ran close to the surface. She bit back comments about irrigation possibilities and crop rotation, sensing that such observations would not be welcomed. Hartwell Ranch announced itself long before they reached the main house. White painted fences stretched toward the horizon, enclosing pastures where prize cattle grazed on imported grass. The ranch house itself was a two-story monument to success, complete with wraparound porches and gingerbread trim that seemed absurd in the desert setting. Servants appeared to take their coats and offer refreshments, moving with the practiced efficiency of well-trained staff. In the parlor, surrounded by furniture shipped from Denver and wallpaper that depicted English hunting scenes, William Hartwell finally asked the question that had been building since the train station. "Tell me about your family's circumstances, Miss Thompson. Your letters mentioned Kansas but were rather vague about specifics." Rebecca set down her teacup with deliberate care. The moment of truth had arrived sooner than she had hoped, but there was no point in delaying the inevitable. "My father owned a farm outside Lawrence, 300 acres of wheat and corn, with cattle and hogs. After my parents died in the influenza outbreak 3 years ago, I worked for neighboring families. I know crops, livestock, and land management." The silence that followed seemed to echo off the expensive wallpaper. William Hartwell's face went through several expressions before settling on something between disappointment and distaste. He stood and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back like a general surveying a failed battlefield. "I see." His voice had gone cold as winter water. "Your correspondence suggested a rather different background. References to household management and social refinement." "I can manage a household," Rebecca said quietly. "I can cook, clean, mend and organize. I can read and write and cipher. I've taught Sunday school and organized church socials. But yes, Mr. Hartwell, I am a farmer's daughter, and I have worked with my hands." He turned from the window, and she saw in his eyes the death of whatever possibilities had existed between them. "Miss Thompson, I'm afraid there has been a fundamental misunderstanding. I require a wife who can represent my interests in proper society. The wife of William Hartwell cannot have dirt under her fingernails, or calluses on her palms. I need someone who understands refinement, not someone who understands soil." The words hit her like physical blows, but Rebecca had learned long ago not to show pain when it would only invite more. She stood with dignity intact, her spine straight as a fence post. "I understand your position, Mr. Hartwell. Perhaps you could direct me to lodging in town while I arrange my return journey." But even as she spoke, Rebecca Thompson knew she had no money for a return ticket. The sale of her parents' farm had barely covered their debts, and the little she had saved working for others had gone toward her traveling expenses and the few nice things she had purchased to impress her. And preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Tended husband. She was 800 miles from anything resembling home, with less than $5 to her name, and nowhere to go. William Hartwell was already moving toward the door, eager to conclude this embarrassing mistake. "Mrs. Kellner runs a respectable boarding house in town. I'm sure she can accommodate you temporarily." He paused, then added with the casual cruelty of a man who had never known real want, "Perhaps in future correspondence you might be more forthcoming about your actual circumstances. Honesty prevents these unfortunate situations." The ride back to town passed in merciful silence. Rebecca stared at the landscape through eyes that refused to shed tears, cataloging the ironies of her situation. She could see places where the land cried out for proper irrigation, spots where different crops could thrive, opportunities for improvement that William Hartwell, with all his money and education, had missed completely. She had skills that could transform this harsh country into something productive, but those same skills made her unworthy of consideration as a wife. At the boarding house, Mrs. Martha Kellner proved to be a woman of middle years with kind eyes and practical sympathy. She took one look at Rebecca's situation and offered a room at reduced rates in exchange for help with cooking and cleaning. It was charity disguised as employment, and both women understood the arrangement perfectly. Rebecca accepted with gratitude that came from understanding exactly how precarious her position had become. That first night in Copper Falls, lying on a narrow bed in a room barely larger than a closet, Rebecca Thompson stared at the ceiling and took inventory of her life. She was alone in a strange place, rejected for being exactly what she had always been proud to be, with no clear path forward and no way back. Outside her window, the desert wind carried sounds she did not recognize, reminders that she was far from everything familiar. But Rebecca Thompson had not survived orphanhood, economic hardship, and 800 miles of uncertainty by surrendering to despair. She had skills, intelligence, and a willingness to work that had seen her through darker times. Tomorrow she would begin the process of building something new from the wreckage of her dreams. She did not yet know what form that future would take, or that it would be shaped by a man whose own struggles with acceptance and belonging would mirror her own in ways she could not imagine. The desert wind continued its ancient song outside her window, carrying with it the sense of sage and possibility. In the morning, everything would change again. Part 2. The Giant's Intervention. Dawn came to Copper Falls like a gunshot, sudden and bright, painting the desert in shades of gold and copper. Rebecca had been awake for an hour, listening to the town stir to life beyond her window. The boarding house kitchen needed tending, and Mrs. Kellner had made it clear that room and board came with expectations. Rebecca dressed quickly in her work dress, a practical garment of brown cotton that had seen her through harvest seasons and barn raisings back in Kansas. The kitchen was already warm from the cook stove when she entered, and Mrs. Kellner looked up from kneading bread dough with approval. "Good, I was hoping you were an early riser. We've got 12 guests for breakfast, and the coffee needs to be strong enough to wake the dead." Working alongside the older woman felt natural in a way that sitting in William Hartwell's parlor never had. Rebecca's hands moved with practiced efficiency, cracking eggs, slicing bacon, stirring batter for flapjacks. The familiar rhythms of cooking soothed something inside her that had been twisted tight since yesterday's humiliation. This was work she understood, work that had value regardless of social pretensions. As they worked, Mrs. Kellner shared the essential gossip that would help Rebecca navigate her new circumstances. The copper mine employed most of the single men in town, but the work was dangerous and the pay inconsistent. The ranchers like Hartwell controlled most of the good land and water rights, making it difficult for smaller farmers to establish themselves. The Apache reservation was 20 miles east, and tensions remained high despite official peace treaties. "There's good people here, Mrs. Kellner said, sliding a pan of biscuits into the oven. "But like anywhere, you've got to know who to trust and who to avoid. William Hartwell's got money and influence, but he's not well liked. Too quick to remind folks of their place, if you catch my meaning." Rebecca caught her meaning perfectly. She had met men like Hartwell before, men who confused wealth with worth and treated others as props in their own stories of success. The sting of his rejection was fading, replaced by a growing certainty that she had dodged a miserable fate disguised as a fortunate marriage. The breakfast service passed in a blur of serving plates and coffee cups, but Rebecca noticed everything. The miner spoke with the careful politeness of men far from home, eating with the focused intensity of those who never knew where their next meal might come from. The town's businessmen discussed cattle prices and railroad schedules with the casual authority of men accustomed to making decisions. And through it all, the undercurrent of conversation revealed a community still finding its shape in the harsh realities of desert life. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Joseph Whitehawk arrived. He had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe, all 6 feet and 4 inches of him moving with the fluid grace of a man completely comfortable in his own skin. His black hair was cut short in the white man's style, but his features proclaimed his Apache heritage without apology. He wore a clean white shirt tucked into dark trousers, with boots that showed both quality and hard use. Everything about him suggested a man who had learned to navigate between two worlds without surrendering his essential self. The conversations in the dining room didn't exactly stop, but they shifted in tone and volume. Rebecca caught the subtle tensions, the way some men straightened in their chairs while others suddenly found their coffee cups fascinating. Joseph Whitehawk was known here, but his reception was complex in ways she was only beginning to understand. Mrs. Kellner bustled forward with genuine warmth. "Joe, haven't seen you in town for 2 weeks. The usual." He smiled, and the expression transformed his angular features completely. "Yes, ma'am, and a pot of that coffee to go if you've got it. Long ride back to the ranch today." Rebecca was refilling water pitchers when their eyes met across the dining room. The impact was immediate and unsettling, like stepping into sunlight after hours in shadow. His gaze was direct without being aggressive, curious without being intrusive. She found herself cataloging details involuntarily. The way his hands rested easily on the table, the small scar above his left eyebrow, the intelligence that flickered behind dark eyes that seemed to see everything. He was still watching her when William Hartwell entered the boarding house like a man claiming territory. His expensive clothes and polished manner seemed suddenly theatrical next to Joseph Whitehawk's quiet presence. Hartwell's gaze swept the room, cataloging who was present with the calculating eye of a man who measured everyone by their potential usefulness to his interests. "Whitehawk." Hartwell's greeting carried the precise neutrality of a man who had learned to mask his true feelings behind social convention. "I wasn't expecting to see you in town so soon." Joseph inclined his head slightly. "Mr. Hartwell, business doesn't wait for convenience." The exchange was perfectly polite and completely hostile. Rebecca watched from the kitchen doorway, fascinated by the undercurrents of tension that seemed to fill the space between the two men. Other conversations had died completely now, leaving only the sound of silverware against plates and the distant whistle of wind through the eaves. Hartwell's attention shifted to Rebecca with the sudden focus of a hawk spotting movement. "Miss Thompson, I trust Mrs. Kellner has made you comfortable while you arrange your travel plans." The words were spoken loudly enough for everyone in the dining room to hear, and Rebecca understood their purpose immediately. Hartwell was announcing her failure, marking her as someone whose dreams had proven inadequate to reality. It was a casual cruelty designed to ensure that her humiliation became public knowledge. But before Rebecca could respond, Joseph Whitehawk spoke into the silence. "Miss Thompson." His voice carried easily across the room, warm with genuine interest. "Martha mentioned you're from Kansas, farming country." The simple acknowledgement changed everything. Instead of shame, Rebecca felt a flicker of pride in her background. She straightened her shoulders and met his gaze directly. "Yes, sir. 300 acres of wheat and corn, some of the best soil in the state when it's worked properly. I'd like to hear about Kansas farming methods sometime." Joseph continued, his tone suggesting genuine professional interest. "Water management's always a challenge in country like this. Different approaches might be worth considering." William Hartwell's face flushed with something between embarrassment and anger. He had intended to diminish Rebecca Thompson, but instead found himself diminished by the contrast between his own pettiness and Joseph Whitehawk's simple decency. "I'm sure Miss Thompson has many opinions about agricultural matters," he said with barely concealed disdain. "Perhaps she'll find someone who shares her practical interests." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Every person in the dining room felt its impact, and Rebecca saw various expressions of discomfort, disapproval, and sympathy flicker across different faces. William Hartwell had revealed more about his character than he intended, and the revelation was not flattering. Joseph Whitehawk stood slowly, his full height making him tower over everyone else in the room. His movement was unhurried but carried an unmistakable sense of purpose. He placed a silver dollar on the table beside his empty plate, then turned to face Hartwell with the patient expression of a man who had dealt with such attitudes many times before. "Mr. Hartwell," he said quietly, "seems to me a man who understands land and growing things might be worth more than one who just owns property. Different kinds of knowledge, different kinds of value." The words were delivered without heat, but their impact was unmistakable. Joseph Whitehawk had just defended Rebecca Thompson's worth in terms that challenged William Hartwell's entire worldview. The silence that followed stretched tight as a bowstring, filled with possibilities that ranged from violence to revelation. Hartwell's hand moved instinctively toward the gun at his hip, then stopped as he remembered where he was and who was watching. Social convention and basic survival instincts warred visibly across his features. Joseph Whitehawk waited calmly, his own hands relaxed at his sides, but something in his stillness suggested that any aggression would be met with swift and decisive response. "I think," Hartwell said finally, his voice tight with controlled fury, "that everyone should mind their own business and stay in their proper place." Joseph smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "Yes, sir, I expect they should." With that he touched the brim of his hat to Mrs. Kellner, nodded respectfully to Rebecca, and walked out of the boarding house with the same unhurried grace with which he had entered. The door closed behind him with a soft click that somehow felt like the period at the end of a sentence. William Hartwell stood in the sudden quiet, his expensive clothes and polished manner no longer seeming quite so impressive. The other diners were carefully avoiding his gaze, suddenly fascinated by their breakfast plates or the view through the windows. He had wanted to establish his dominance, and instead had been quietly but thoroughly diminished by a man he considered his social inferior. "Well," Mrs. Kellner said briskly, breaking the tension with practiced efficiency, "more coffee, anyone? Rebecca, would you mind checking on those biscuits?" Normal conversation gradually resumed, but Rebecca noticed that William Hartwell finished his meal quickly and left without speaking to anyone else. She also noticed that several of the other diners made a point of complimenting her cooking and thanking her for the service. Small gestures, but they carried the weight of acceptance that Hartwell's money had failed to purchase. As she cleaned tables and washed dishes, Rebecca found herself thinking about Joseph Whitehawk. Not just his striking appearance or the way he had defended her, but something deeper. He had recognized the value in her background when others saw only shame. He had spoken of farming methods as if her knowledge might actually be useful rather than embarrassing. In a few sentences, he had restored her sense of worth more effectively than months of self-encouragement might have accomplished. That afternoon, while Mrs. Kellner napped and the boarding house settled into midday quiet, Rebecca walked to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open desert. She needed space to think, air that didn't carry the weight of other people's expectations and judgments. The landscape stretched away in all directions, harsh but beautiful, demanding respect rather than conquest. She was standing there, trying to imagine a future that made sense, when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Joseph Whitehawk rode up on a paint horse that moved with the same fluid grace as its rider. He dismounted 20 feet away, respecting her space while making his presence known. "Miss Thompson," he touched his hat brim in greeting. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion. Wanted to apologize for the scene at breakfast." Rebecca turned to face him fully, noting again his impressive height, and the way he seemed completely comfortable in the vastness of the desert setting. "You have nothing to apologize for, Mr. Whitehawk. You were defending my honor when no one else would." "Joseph," he said, "and I wasn't just defending your honor, I was speaking the truth. Knowledge about land and growing things matters out here, matters more than most people understand." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both looking out at the harsh beauty of the desert landscape. Rebecca found herself wondering what he saw when he looked at this land, whether his vision included possibilities that escaped others' notice. "Can I ask you something?" she said finally. "Yes, ma'am. Why did you speak up for me? You don't know anything about me except what Mrs. Kellner might have mentioned." Joseph considered the question seriously, his dark eyes studying her face as if reading something written there. "Maybe it's because I know what it's like to be judged for things that shouldn't matter. Maybe because I could see you understood more about this country in 5 minutes than some folks learn in 5 years. Or maybe because someone needed to say that having dirt under your fingernails isn't something to be ashamed of." His words struck something deep inside her, a recognition of kinship that went beyond the circumstances that had brought them together. Rebecca Thompson had spent her entire adult life being measured against standards that had nothing to do with her actual capabilities. Here was a man who understood that struggle from his own experience.
"Thank you," she said simply. Joseph nodded and remounted his horse with easy grace. "I've got a small ranch about 10 miles north of here. Nothing fancy, but the land's good and the water's reliable. If you're interested in seeing how farming might work in this country, you'd be welcome to visit. Mrs. Kellner knows the way." He rode off without waiting for an answer, leaving Rebecca alone with the desert wind and the sudden sense that her future might hold possibilities she had never imagined. As she walked back toward town, the weight of rejection and uncertainty that had pressed down on her since yesterday began to lift. For the first time since stepping off the train in Copper Falls, she felt like someone had seen her clearly and found her worthy of respect. The sun was setting behind the mountains when she reached the boarding house, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded her that beauty could exist even in the harshest places. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and decisions, but tonight she would sleep better than she had since leaving Kansas. Someone had reminded her that she had value, and that reminder was worth more than all of William Hartwell's wealth and social position. In the kitchen, helping Mrs. Kellner prepare dinner for the evening guests, Rebecca found herself humming for the first time in months. The older woman noticed and smiled but said nothing. Some changes spoke for themselves. Outside, the desert wind carried the sense of sage and distant rain, promises of possibilities yet to be revealed. 3 days passed before Rebecca saw Joseph Whitehawk again. 3 days of helping Mrs. Kellner with the boarding house duties, learning the rhythms of Copper Falls, and trying to piece together a plan for her future that didn't involve begging for train fare back to Kansas. She had written letters to distant relatives, inquiring about work possibilities, but the responses would take weeks to arrive. In the meantime, she existed in a state of suspended uncertainty, grateful for Mrs. Kellner's kindness but aware that charity had its limits. The morning was crisp with the promise of winter when she walked to the general store to purchase thread for mending the boarding house linens. The miner's supply was busy with men buying supplies for another day underground, their faces already showing the gray pallor that came from breathing rock dust. Rebecca moved among them carefully, aware of the attention her presence drew. Some of the looks were respectful, others calculating, and a few carried the kind of hunger that made her grateful for the busy public setting. She was examining spools of cotton thread when she heard her name spoken behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with a woman she had not yet met, though the expensive fabric of her dress and the careful arrangement of her hair suggested money and social position. The woman was perhaps 40, with sharp features that might have been beautiful if they had not been hardened by years of measuring everyone she met against her own sense of superiority. "Miss Thompson." The woman's voice carried the precise diction of someone who had learned to speak as a weapon. "I'm Mrs. Adelaide Hartwell, William's wife." Rebecca felt her stomach tighten with dread. She had hoped to avoid further contact with the Hartwell family, but apparently that hope had been naive. She managed a polite nod. "Mrs. Hartwell, I understand there was some unpleasantness regarding your arrangement with my husband." Adelaide Hartwell's pale eyes studied Rebecca with the intensity of a judge evaluating evidence. "I wanted to speak with you about the situation." The other customers in the store were now openly listening to their conversation, and Rebecca realized that whatever Adelaide Hartwell intended to say would become public knowledge within hours. She also realized that refusing to listen would only make things worse. "Of course, Mrs. Hartwell. William explained that you had misrepresented your background in your correspondence, that you had allowed him to
believe you were from a refined family, when in fact you are merely a farmer's daughter." Adelaide's voice carried just enough volume to ensure that everyone nearby could hear clearly. "I want you to understand that while I sympathize with your desperation, such deception cannot be overlooked." Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she kept her voice steady. "I never claimed to be anything other than what I am, Mrs. Hartwell. If your husband made assumptions based on incomplete information, that is not my responsibility." "Oh, but it is." Adelaide stepped closer, her perfume sharp and cloying in the dry desert air. You see, my husband's reputation matters in this community. His standing affects business relationships, social connections, political influence. When someone like you attempts to attach herself to the Hartwell name through deception, it reflects poorly on all of us." The cruelty was breathtaking in its casual precision. Adelaide Hartwell was not just defending her husband's decision. She was making sure that Rebecca Thompson understood her place in the social hierarchy of Copper Falls. The message was clear: stay in your proper station or face consequences. "I understand your concern for your husband's reputation," Rebecca said carefully. "I assure you I have no desire to cause problems for anyone. I'm simply trying to make an honest living while I arrange my affairs." "Yes, about that." Adelaide's smile held no warmth. "I've heard you're working at the boarding house." "How appropriate. And I understand you've caught the attention of certain other individuals in town. I hope you'll be careful about the associations you form. Some connections can be even more damaging to one's reputation than others." The reference to Joseph Whitehawk was unmistakable, and Rebecca felt anger flare inside her chest like a struck match. Adelaide Hartwell was not content with humiliating her about her background. She was also warning her away from the one person in Copper Falls who had shown her genuine respect. "I'll be careful to associate only with people of good character," Rebecca said evenly. "Those who judge others by their actions rather than their ancestry or circumstances." Adelaide's eyes narrowed at the subtle insult. She had come here to establish dominance, but Rebecca's refusal to be properly cowed was disrupting her script. "Miss Thompson, I think you may not fully understand your situation here. This is a small community with long memories. People who don't fit in, who cause problems or align themselves with the wrong elements, often find life here quite difficult." The threat was delivered with a smile, but its meaning was crystal clear. The Hartwells had money and influence in Copper Falls, and they were prepared to use both to make Rebecca's life miserable if she didn't accept her assigned role as the rejected mail-order bride who knew her place. Before Rebecca could respond, the door of the general store opened with a sharp jingle of bells. Joseph Whitehawk entered, his tall frame requiring him to duck slightly under the low doorway. His presence immediately changed the atmosphere in the store, conversations dying away as everyone turned to watch what would happen next. Joseph's dark eyes swept the scene, taking in Adelaide Hartwell's aggressive posture and Rebecca's carefully controlled tension. His expression remained neutral, but something about his stillness suggested a predator deciding whether the situation required action. "Mrs. Hartwell." His greeting was polite but carried no deference. "Miss Thompson." The warmth in his voice when he spoke Rebecca's name was unmistakable, and she saw Adelaide's face tighten with displeasure. "Mr. Whitehawk." Adelaide's pronunciation of his name carried just enough emphasis to remind everyone of his Apache heritage. "How unexpected to see you in town again so soon." Joseph moved to the counter where Rebecca stood, close enough that she could smell the scent of leather and sage smoke that seemed to cling to his clothes. His proximity felt like protection, though he made no threatening gestures or spoke any challenging words. "Business brings me to town regular," he said calmly. "Today I'm hoping to find someone with knowledge about irrigation techniques. Heard there might be someone in Copper Falls who understands how to make desert land productive." The implication was clear to everyone present. Joseph Whitehawk was publicly declaring his interest in Rebecca's expertise, positioning her knowledge as valuable rather than shameful. It was a direct challenge to the Hartwells' attempt to diminish her worth. Adelaide's face flushed with anger at being outmaneuvered so smoothly. She had come here to establish Rebecca's powerlessness, but Joseph's presence and obvious respect for Rebecca's abilities was undermining her message. Worse, she realized that any direct attack on Joseph would reveal more about her own prejudices than about his worthiness as a member of the community. "How practical," Adelaide said finally, her voice tight with controlled fury. "I'm sure Miss Thompson's experience will be useful for certain kinds of endeavors." The dismissive tone was intended to minimize Rebecca's value, but Joseph's response cut through the pretense with surgical precision. "Yes, ma'am. Experience with growing things, understanding soil and water, knowing how to make land feed people instead of just looking pretty. Valuable knowledge in country like this." Each word was chosen deliberately, contrasting practical usefulness with empty appearance, substance with mere show. Joseph was not just defending Rebecca, he was questioning the entire value system that Adelaide Hartwell represented. The silence that followed stretched tight as a drumhead. Every person in the store understood that they were witnessing more than just a disagreement between individuals. They were seeing a clash between different visions of what mattered in frontier life. Money and social position on one side, practical knowledge and genuine competence on the other. Adelaide Hartwell realized that she had lost control of the situation. Her attempt to publicly humiliate Rebecca had backfired, transforming what should have been a demonstration of power into a revelation of her own shallow priorities. She gathered her composure with visible effort. "Well," she said with forced lightness, "I'm sure everyone will make their own judgments about what kind of knowledge has real value. Good day, Miss Thompson, Mr. Whitehawk." She swept out of the store with as much dignity as she could muster, but everyone present understood that she was retreating, rather than concluding a successful campaign. After the door closed behind Adelaide Hartwell, normal conversation gradually resumed, though Rebecca noticed that several people made a point of nodding respectfully in her direction. Joseph's public support had shifted the social dynamics, making it clear that dismissing Rebecca Thompson would also mean dismissing someone the community had learned to respect. "Thank you," she said quietly as Joseph moved to examine the selection of rope and hardware. "Nothing to thank me for," he replied, his attention apparently focused on testing the strength of different hemp varieties. "Just stating facts." But Rebecca understood that it had been much more than that. Joseph had not only defended her, he had skillfully repositioned the entire conflict. Instead of allowing Adelaide to frame the issue as proper society versus unacceptable origins, he had reframed it as practical value versus empty pretense. It was a masterful piece of social maneuvering that revealed as much about his intelligence as his character. "I've been thinking about your invitation," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "To see your ranch, to discuss irrigation and farming techniques." Joseph looked up from the rope, his dark eyes meeting hers directly. "And I'd to accept, if the offer still stands." "It stands." He paused, considering something. "Mrs. Kellner mentioned you might be interested in seeing how different crops might work in this climate. I've got some experimental plots going. Nothing fancy, but the results have been promising." The idea that Joseph Whitehawk was conducting agricultural experiments sent a thrill of professional excitement through Rebecca. Here was someone who understood that farming was about more than just following established patterns. It required constant adaptation and innovation. The thought of discussing such work with someone who shared her passion was more appealing than any social invitation she had ever received. "When would be convenient?" she asked. "Tomorrow morning. I could pick you up at the boarding house around 9. Give you time to see the place properly and still get back to town before evening." Rebecca nodded, already anticipating the visit with something approaching eagerness. For the first time since arriving in Copper Falls, she would have the opportunity to engage with work that truly interested her, to share knowledge with someone who valued her expertise rather than being ashamed of it. After Joseph left the store, Rebecca completed her purchases in an atmosphere that felt noticeably different from when she had entered. People who had previously seemed indifferent now offered friendly greetings. The store clerk took extra care in helping her select the best quality thread. Small gestures, but they added up to acceptance rather than mere tolerance. Walking back to the boarding house, Rebecca reflected on how quickly circumstances could change. Yesterday she had been an embarrassing mistake, a woman whose background made her unsuitable for proper society. Today, thanks to Joseph Whitehawk's public support, she was someone whose knowledge had recognized value. The transformation felt almost magical, but she understood that it was really about having an ally who possessed both the courage and the social standing to challenge prevailing assumptions. Mrs. Kellner was hanging laundry in the backyard when Rebecca returned, and the older woman's knowing smile suggested that news of the confrontation in the general store had already reached her ears. "Heard you had an interesting encounter with Adelaide Hartwell," Mrs. Kellner said without preamble. "Also heard that Joe Whitehawk happened along at just the right moment." Rebecca began helping with the laundry, grateful for the familiar world. Mrs. Hartwell was concerned about her husband's reputation. Adelaide Hartwell's been concerned about one thing or another since she arrived in Copper Falls 5 years ago. Mrs. Kellner said dryly, "Woman thinks being married to money makes her queen of the territory. Forgets that out here, people judge you by what you can do, not what you can buy." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, the desert wind whipping the wet sheets like ship sails. Rebecca found herself thinking about tomorrow's visit to Joseph's ranch, wondering what she might learn about farming in this harsh but beautiful landscape. "Martha," she said finally, "what do you know about Joseph Whitehawk? I mean beyond what I've seen myself." Mrs. Kellner paused in her work, considering the question seriously. "Joe's what you might call complicated. His mother was Apache, his father Mexican. Grew up speaking 3 languages and belonging fully to none of the groups that claimed parts of him. Spent time at the Indian school back east, learned to read and write and cipher better than most white men. Came back here about 8 years ago and bought that little ranch with money he'd saved working for the railroad." She shook out a pillowcase with more force than necessary. "Some folks around here never got used to the idea of an Apache man owning property, especially property with good water rights. There's been incidents, nothing you could take to the sheriff mind you, but enough to let him know he wasn't entirely welcome." Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert wind. "What kind of incidents?" "Fences cut, cattle scattered. Once someone poisoned his well, though they couldn't prove who did it. Joe handles it all quiet like, fixes what needs fixing, doesn't make a fuss. But I know it wears on him." Mrs. Kellner met Rebecca's eyes directly. "Point is, Joe Whitehawk's got his own battles to fight. Taking up for you in public the way he did, that took courage. Adelaide Hartwell's got a long memory and a longer reach when it comes to making life difficult for people who cross her." The weight of what Joseph had risked for her sake settled on Rebecca's shoulders like a heavy shawl. She had been grateful for his support, but had not fully considered what that support might cost him. The realization made her respect for him deepen even as it added complexity to her own situation. "Why do you think he did it?" she asked. Mrs. Kellner smiled, but there was sadness in the expression. "Maybe because he recognizes someone else who's been judged for things that shouldn't matter. Maybe because he's got a good heart and can't stand to see unfairness. Or maybe because he sees something in you that others have missed." She paused, studying Rebecca's face. "Question is, what are you going to do with the opportunity he's given you?" That evening, as Rebecca helped serve dinner to the boarding house guests, she found herself thinking about Mrs. Kellner's question. Joseph Whitehawk had publicly aligned himself with her, had offered her respect and recognition when others offered only contempt or pity. But acceptance of his support came with obligations and risks that she was only beginning to understand. The dining room conversation that night centered largely around the confrontation in the general store, though no one addressed the topic directly. Instead, there was talk about the value of practical knowledge in frontier communities, about the importance of judging people by their character rather than their circumstances, about the wisdom of certain individuals who understood both land management and human nature. Rebecca understood that she was being discussed without being named, and that the consensus seemed to favor the position that Joseph had articulated. But she also noticed the absence of certain usual diners, men who typically ate their evening meal at the boarding house but had chosen to take their business elsewhere tonight. The division in community opinion was becoming visible, and she was uncomfortably aware of being at the center of that division. After the dishes were cleaned and the kitchen restored to order, Rebecca sat by her window looking out at the desert landscape silver in moonlight. Tomorrow she would see Joseph Whitehawk's ranch, would discuss agricultural techniques and irrigation methods with someone who shared her passion for making the land productive. The prospect filled her with anticipation unlike anything she had felt since leaving Kansas. But she was also aware that tomorrow would mark another step away from the safe anonymity of rejection and failure. Joseph's interest in her knowledge and abilities was flattering, but it also placed her in a position where her actions would be scrutinized by people whose approval or disapproval could significantly impact her future in Copper Falls. The desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain,
reminders that this harsh landscape could be both beautiful and treacherous. Rebecca Thompson was beginning to understand that the same might be true of the opportunities and dangers that lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring new possibilities, but also new risks. The question was whether she possessed the courage to embrace both. Sleep came slowly that night, filled with dreams of green fields and flowing water, of hands working soil and seeds taking root in desert ground. When she woke before dawn, Rebecca felt more rested than she had in weeks. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would meet them with the same determination that had carried her through orphanhood, poverty, and the long journey to Arizona territory. The morning sun was painting the mountains gold when she dressed carefully in her most practical clothing. Today she would be evaluated not as a potential wife or social ornament, but as someone with knowledge and skills worth respecting. The difference felt like stepping from shadow into sunlight, and Rebecca Thompson walked downstairs to breakfast with her spine straight and her head held high. Mrs. Kellner was already in the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared the morning meal. She looked up as Rebecca entered, and her smile carried the warmth of genuine affection. "Big day today," the older woman said. "Joe's ranch is something to see. Good land, well managed, and he's got ideas about farming that might interest you." "I'm looking forward to it," Rebecca replied, and realized that the words carried more truth than she had spoken in months. Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats announced that Joseph Whitehawk was arriving precisely on time. Rebecca smoothed her skirts, checked that her hair was properly pinned, and prepared to step into whatever future awaited her beyond the familiar walls of the boarding house. For the first time since arriving in Copper Falls, she felt like she was moving towards something rather than simply away from disappointment. The morning was bright with possibility, and Rebecca Thompson was ready to discover what that possibility might hold. Joseph Whitehawk sat his horse like he had been born in the saddle, which Rebecca suspected might not be far from the truth. He had brought a gentle mare for her to ride, a chestnut with intelligent eyes and a patient temperament that suggested careful selection for this particular purpose. As he helped her mount, his hands were steady and respectful, offering assistance without condescension. "Luna's been with me for 6 years," he said, adjusting the stirrups to accommodate Rebecca's shorter legs. "She's got good sense and a smooth gait, won't give you any trouble." The ride out of Copper Falls took them through landscape that shifted and evolved like chapters in a book about the desert's complexity. At first the terrain was familiar from her walks to the edge of town, flat expanses of red earth punctuated by sagebrush and the occasional stunted juniper. But as they traveled north, the land began to rise and change, revealing hidden valleys where water ran closer to the surface, and different plants had found purchase in more hospitable soil. Joseph rode slightly ahead, following what seemed to be nothing more than animal tracks through the brush. But Rebecca gradually realized that he was following a carefully planned route that avoided the worst of the rough ground while revealing the most interesting features of the landscape. This was not simply transportation, it was education, a guided tour designed to show her possibilities she might otherwise have missed. "See that dark line of vegetation running east," he said, pointing toward what looked like a random scatter of trees and brush. "Underground water there. Follows the old riverbed. Probably runs year-round even in dry seasons. Good place for crops that need steady moisture." Rebecca studied the distant green line, noting how it curved through the landscape following contours that suggested the path water would naturally take. Back in Kansas, such signs had been less important because rainfall was more reliable. But here they represented the difference between success and failure for any farming operation. "How deep would you have to dig to reach it?" she asked. "Depends on the season and the specific location. Anywhere from 4 feet to maybe 15. Lot of work but worth it for the right crops." He gestured toward another area where the plant life was noticeably different. "That slope there catches runoff from the hills. Good place for crops that can handle flooding in spring, but need to be drought-tolerant later in the season." His knowledge of the land was impressive, but what struck Rebecca even more was his systematic approach to understanding and utilizing natural water patterns. This was not casual observation, but careful study applied over years of living and working in this specific environment. They created a rise, and suddenly Joseph's ranch spread before them, nestled in a valley that seemed almost impossibly green after the sparse desert they had traversed. Water sparkled in irrigation channels that divided the property into carefully planned sections, some planted with crops Rebecca recognized, and others showing vegetation she had never seen before. Buildings were scattered across the landscape with the practical efficiency of someone who understood both human needs and livestock requirements. "It's beautiful," Rebecca said, and meant it. The ranch was not beautiful in the ornamental sense that might appeal to someone like Adelaide Hartwell, but in the functional way of something designed to work in harmony with its environment. Joseph's slight smile suggested pleasure at her appreciation. "Took me 8 years to get it looking like this. First few seasons, I lost more crops than I harvested. Had to learn what would work and what wouldn't." As they rode down into the valley, Rebecca began to notice details that revealed the intelligence behind the ranch's design. The irrigation channels followed natural contours, minimizing the work required to move water while ensuring even distribution. Buildings were positioned to take advantage of natural windbreaks and morning sun. Fencing patterns suggested careful thought about livestock movement and pasture rotation. The main house was modest but well built, constructed from local stone with a broad porch that provided shade during the heat of the day. Corrals and outbuildings showed the same practical attention to function over ornament, designed by someone who understood the daily requirements of ranch life. "Let me show you the experimental plots first," Joseph said, as they dismounted near the barn. "Those might be most interesting to someone with your background." They walked through fields where traditional crops like corn and beans grew alongside plants Rebecca did not recognize. Joseph explained his systematic approach to testing different varieties and species, keeping careful records of water requirements, soil preferences, and yield results. "This is amaranth," he said, indicating a section of plants with broad leaves and dramatic red flower heads. "Traditional Apache crop, very drought-tolerant. Seeds are nutritious, leaves can be eaten like spinach. Grows well here with minimal irrigation." Rebecca knelt to examine the soil around the amaranth plants, noting its texture and moisture content. "What kind of yields are you getting?" "Better than I expected. This plot produced about 30 pounds of seed from a quarter-acre planting. Not much compared to wheat or corn in good soil, but considering the water requirements, it's impressive." They moved through section after section, Joseph explaining his experiments with different irrigation methods, soil amendments, and crop rotations. Rebecca found herself asking increasingly technical questions, and was pleased to discover that Joseph's knowledge could match her curiosity. This was the kind of professional conversation she had missed desperately, the sharing of expertise between people who understood that farming was both art and science. "The key insight," Joseph said as they examined a section where he was testing different beans, "was realizing that I needed to work with the land instead of trying to force it to behave like somewhere else. These desert varieties produce less per plant than varieties bred for Kansas or Ohio, but they require less water and can handle temperature extremes that would kill other crops." Rebecca nodded, understanding immediately what he meant: efficiency rather than maximum production. Better to get a reliable smaller harvest than to risk losing everything trying for bigger yields. "Exactly." His smile at her quick comprehension was warmer than the desert sun. "You understand the mathematics of survival farming." They spent the next hour examining different crops and discussing possibilities for expansion. Rebecca found herself suggesting modifications to his irrigation system, improvements to his crop rotation schedule, experiments with companion planting that might improve yields while maintaining drought tolerance. Joseph listened to each suggestion with the focused attention of someone who recognized valuable expertise when he heard it. The sun was approaching its zenith when Joseph led her to a shaded area near the main house where a table and chairs waited beneath a ramada constructed from poles and brush. Cold water and simple food appeared almost immediately, prepared by an elderly Apache woman who nodded respectfully to Rebecca before retreating to give them privacy. "That's Maria," Joseph explained. "My mother's sister. She keeps house for me and makes sure I remember to eat regularly. Don't speak much English, but she understands more than she lets on." Rebecca sipped the cold water gratefully, realizing that the morning's excitement had made her forget the dry intensity of the desert air. "Your ranch is impressive. The planning, the systematic approach to adapting crops to local conditions. Where did you learn to think about farming that way?" Joseph was quiet for a moment, his dark eyes studying the landscape that surrounded them. Some of it came from the Indian school. They taught scientific method, systematic record-keeping, the importance of testing theories against results. But most of it came from necessity. "When I bought this land I had enough money for one chance to make it work. Couldn't afford to fail based on assumptions or wishful thinking." Rebecca understood the pressure he was describing. The difference between their situations was that he had chosen this challenge while she had fallen into it. But the fundamental requirement was the same: succeed or face destitution in a place that offered few second chances. "It must have been lonely," she said, "learning everything through trial and error, without anyone to share ideas with." It was. His admission came without self-pity, simply stating a fact. "There's other ranchers in the area, but most of them run cattle exclusively. Not much interest in crop experiments. And the few farmers are mostly trying to recreate what they knew from back east rather than adapting to local conditions." The loneliness he described resonated with Rebecca's own experience of professional isolation. She had spent years working for other people who were content with traditional methods, unable to discuss innovations or improvements with anyone who shared her passion for the technical aspects of agriculture. "What about the Apache community?" she asked. "Traditional knowledge about plants and farming in this region." Joseph's expression grew complex, showing layers of connection and separation that she was only beginning to understand. "Some. Maria knows which wild plants are useful, when to harvest them, how to prepare them. The older people remember farming methods from before the reservation period. But much of that knowledge was lost during the conflicts, and what remains is sometimes seen as backward by people who've accepted that the white man's way is the only path to success." Rebecca heard the pain behind his careful words, understanding that he was caught between worlds in ways that went far beyond the simple matter of racial identity. His education and success in adopting white farming methods might have separated him from some aspects of his Apache heritage, while his ancestry prevented full
acceptance in the broader community of successful ranchers. "But you're finding ways to combine both approaches," she suggested, trying to. The amaranth was Maria's suggestion, though she knows it by a different name. Some of the irrigation techniques came from stories about how things were done before the rivers were diverted for mining operations. He paused, considering something. "It's complicated trying to honor traditional knowledge while adapting to new realities." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, both understanding that they were discussing more than just farming techniques. Rebecca was beginning to appreciate the full complexity of Joseph's position in the community, the delicate balance he maintained between different expectations and identities. "Joseph," she said finally, "what you've accomplished here is remarkable. The systematic experimentation, the adaptation to local conditions, the integration of different approaches. You've created something unique." His smile at her praise was genuine but tinged with something that might have been wistfulness. "It's a good life, productive, mostly peaceful, but it would be better shared with someone who understood what I'm trying to achieve." The statement hung in the air between them, carrying implications that both acknowledged and neither was quite ready to address directly. Rebecca felt her pulse quicken with the recognition that this conversation was moving beyond professional consultation towards something more personal. Before she could respond, the sound of approaching horses broke the moment. 3 riders were coming up the valley at a pace that suggested urgency rather than casual visiting. Joseph rose smoothly to his feet, his body language shifting from relaxed host to alert guardian without apparent effort. "Trouble," he said quietly, and Rebecca heard in his voice the wariness of someone who had dealt with such situations before. The riders were white men, dressed in the rough clothes of working cowboys but carrying themselves with an arrogance that suggested they were accustomed to having their demands met without question. The leader was a man of perhaps 35 with the kind of swagger that often masked fundamental insecurity about his own competence. Rebecca recognized the type from her years working for different employers, men who used bluster and intimidation to compensate for their lack of actual skill or knowledge. "White Hawk," the leader called out as they approached the ramada. "We need to talk." Joseph moved to intercept them before they could come too close to where Rebecca sat, positioning himself between potential threat and guest with unconscious protectiveness. "Murphy, what brings you to my land?" "Your land." Murphy's laugh held no humor. "That's what we need to discuss. Seems there's been some confusion about property boundaries lately. Some of your crops have been spreading onto land that doesn't belong to you." Rebecca felt cold understanding settle in her stomach. This was not about property boundaries or crop placement. This was about something much more dangerous, the kind of manufactured grievance that could justify violence while maintaining a pretense of legal justification. Joseph's voice remained calm, but Rebecca could see the tension in his shoulders. "My crops are planted well within my property lines, Murphy. You know that as well as I do." "See, that's where you're wrong." Murphy dismounted, his companions following suit with the coordinated movement of men who had planned this confrontation. "Been talking to folks about the original survey marks, and turns out some of them might not be where they're supposed to be. Might be you've been farming land that legally belongs to someone else." The accusation was absurd on its face. Property surveys were matters of public record, and Joseph had owned his ranch for 8 years without any boundary disputes. But Rebecca understood that legal accuracy was not the point of this visit. Murphy and his companions were creating a pretext for harassment that could escalate into something much worse if not handled carefully. "My deed is properly recorded and my boundaries are clearly marked," Joseph said evenly. "If you have concerns about the survey, you're welcome to file a complaint with the Territorial Land Office." Murphy's grin widened, revealing teeth stained with tobacco. "Oh, we might just do that. But in the meantime, seems like the neighborly thing would be for you to stop farming those disputed areas. Just temporary, you understand, until things get sorted out proper." The demand was outrageous. Murphy was asking Joseph to abandon significant portions of his cultivated land based on nothing more than vague accusations about survey accuracy. It was extortion disguised as reasonable caution, and everyone present understood the true nature of the transaction being proposed. "I won't abandon legally planted crops based on unsubstantiated claims," Joseph replied. "If you have evidence of survey errors, present it through proper legal channels." Murphy's expression hardened at Joseph's refusal to be intimidated. "You know, White Hawk, for someone in your position you sure don't seem to understand how things work around here. Might be you need some education about getting along with your neighbors." The threat was becoming explicit, and Rebecca realized that she was witnessing the kind of incident that Mrs. Kellner had described. Joseph was being systematically harassed by men who used his racial identity as justification for behavior they would never dare direct toward a white rancher with equal property rights. But before the confrontation could escalate further, the sound of additional hoofbeats announced another arrival. Rebecca looked toward the entrance to the valley and felt her heart sink as she recognized William Hartwell approaching on his expensive black gelding. His presence transformed what had been a manageable situation into something much more dangerous. Hartwell surveyed the scene with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating opportunities for personal advantage. His eyes lingered on Rebecca, and she saw in his expression a combination of anger and satisfaction that suggested he viewed this situation as a chance to settle multiple scores simultaneously. "White Hawk," Hartwell said as he dismounted. "Miss Thompson, how interesting to find you both here together." The implications in his tone were unmistakable. Hartwell was suggesting impropriety in Rebecca's visit to Joseph's ranch, adding sexual scandal to the existing tensions about property rights. It was a masterful escalation that could justify almost any response from the assembled men. Joseph stepped forward, his full height making him tower over everyone else present. "Mr. Hartwell, if you have business with me, state it plainly." "Oh, my business is quite plain. Hartwell's smile was cold as winter wind. It seems that certain individuals in this community have forgotten their proper place, forgotten the importance of respecting boundaries, both legal and social. Perhaps it's time for a reminder about how civilized people conduct themselves. Rebecca understood with crystal clarity that she had walked into the middle of something much larger and more dangerous than a simple property dispute. The men surrounding them were not interested in irrigation methods or crop yields. They were interested in putting Joseph Whitehawk back in what they considered his proper place, and they intended to use her presence as additional justification for whatever violence they had planned. The afternoon sun beat down on the desert valley like a hammer on an anvil, and Rebecca Thompson realized that her new life in Arizona territory was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. The question was whether she possessed the courage to stand with the man who had shown her respect when others offered only contempt, even if that choice carried consequences she was not prepared to face. Joseph Whitehawk stood calmly in the center of the gathering storm, outnumbered but not outmatched, waiting to see what choice the woman he had invited to share his vision of the future would make when that future was threatened by the very forces that had brought them together. The silence stretched across the valley like a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. Rebecca could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders as 5 pairs of eyes waited to see what she would do. Murphy and his companion shifted restlessly in their saddles, hands drifting toward gun belts with practiced casualness. William Hartwell stood with arms crossed, his expensive clothes and polished boots a stark contrast to the working men he had brought with him. Maria had vanished from sight, but Rebecca sensed the older woman's presence somewhere nearby, probably armed and ready to defend her nephew if violence erupted. Joseph remained motionless, his dark eyes fixed on Hartwell with the patient intensity of a hunter waiting for prey to reveal its intentions. But Rebecca noticed the subtle shift in his posture, the way his weight had moved to the balls of his feet, the loose positioning of his hands that would allow quick access to the Colt revolver worn low on his hip. He was outnumbered 4-1, but something in his stillness suggested that those odds might not favor his opponents as much as they assumed. The desert wind picked up dust devils in the distance, tiny whirlwinds that danced across the valley floor like spirits restless for resolution. Rebecca watched them spin and dissipate, thinking of how her own life had become similarly unsettled since arriving in Arizona territory. Every choice she made seemed to create new complications, new dangers, new possibilities for either salvation or destruction. "Miss Thompson," Hartwell said finally, his voice carrying the false courtesy of a man who had already decided her fate. "I'm surprised to find you here. Surely Mrs. Kellner mentioned the importance of maintaining appropriate associations, especially for someone in your circumstances." The words were chosen with surgical precision, designed to remind everyone present of her failed engagement, her dependence on charity, her vulnerable position in the community. Hartwell was offering her a chance to distance herself from Joseph, to preserve what little social standing she possessed by abandoning the man who had shown her respect when others offered only contempt. Rebecca felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came with being cornered, with having to choose between safety and principle. Throughout her life she had usually chosen safety, accepting diminishment rather than risking confrontation with those who held power over her circumstances. But standing in Joseph's valley, surrounded by the evidence of his intelligence and hard work, she found that old pattern of submission harder to maintain. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart, "I'm visiting Mr. Whitehawk's ranch to discuss agricultural techniques. His methods for desert farming are quite innovative." Hartwell's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Agricultural techniques? How practical of you." His gaze swept over Joseph's cultivated fields with dismissive contempt. "Though I wonder if you fully understand what kind of man you're choosing to associate with." The implication was clear. Hartwell was not just questioning Joseph's character. He was suggesting that Rebecca's judgment was fatally flawed, that she was too naive or desperate to recognize obvious dangers. It was another attempt to diminish her agency, to position her as a victim who needed protection from her own poor decisions. Joseph spoke before Rebecca could respond, his voice carrying quiet authority. "Miss Thompson is welcome on my land any time." She understands more about farming and land management than most people in this territory. Murphy spat into the dust, his patience with civilized conversation clearly exhausted. Nobody asked what you think, Apache. This is white folks' business. The racial slur hung in the air like smoke from a grass fire, poisonous and spreading. Rebecca saw Joseph's jaw tighten, but his expression remained controlled. He had heard such language before, had learned to endure it without giving his enemies the satisfaction of visible reaction. But Rebecca had never heard such language directed at someone she respected, someone whose knowledge and character she had come to value. The ugliness of it hit her like a physical blow, making her understand with sudden clarity what Joseph faced every day simply for existing in a world that questioned his right to success. That's enough. Her words cut through the tension with unexpected force. I'll not stand here and listen to such language directed at a man whose hospitality I'm enjoying. Murphy's eyes narrowed as he focused on her with new attention. You got something to say, farm girl? The contempt in his voice was palpable, but Rebecca found that it no longer had the power to intimidate her. She had been dismissed, insulted and threatened too many times in the past week to retain any illusions about the cost of standing up for herself. I'm saying that Joseph Whitehawk has shown me more courtesy and respect than anyone else in this territory, she replied firmly. I'm also saying that his ranch is obviously well managed and productive, which suggests he knows considerably more about land use than people who spend their time riding around making threats instead of working. The insult was subtle but unmistakable, and Rebecca saw Murphy's face flush with anger. She had just suggested that he and his companions were lazy troublemakers rather than legitimate ranchers, that Joseph's success made their failures more obvious by comparison. Hartwell stepped forward, his expression dark with fury. Miss Thompson, you're making a serious mistake, aligning yourself with the wrong people, saying things you might regret. The only thing I regret, Rebecca said, surprising herself with her boldness, is wasting time listening to men who judge others by their bloodline rather than their accomplishments. The silence that followed her words was electric with possibility. Rebecca had not just defended Joseph, she had openly challenged the racial hierarchy that gave men like Hartwell and Murphy their sense of superiority. It was a line once crossed could not be uncrossed, a declaration that would have consequences regardless of how this confrontation ended. Joseph moved slightly closer to her, not protectively but in solidarity. His presence at her shoulder felt like reinforcement rather than shelter, acknowledgement that she had chosen to stand with him despite the risks. Seems like the ladies made her position clear, he said quietly. Question now is whether you gentlemen have actual business to discuss or if you just came here to make noise. Murphy's hand moved toward his gun, the motion casual but unmistakable. Maybe our business is teaching folks about respect, about knowing their place. And maybe, said a new voice from behind them, your business is trespassing on private property without invitation. Everyone turned toward the source of the interruption. An elderly Apache man had emerged from the brush at the edge of the valley, moving with the silent grace of someone who had spent a lifetime learning to read landscape and weather. He was dressed in a mixture of traditional and white man's clothing, his long gray hair braided with leather and silver ornaments that caught the afternoon light. Despite his age, he carried himself with the dignity of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Joseph's posture relaxed slightly at the older man's appearance. Uncle Samuel, these men were just leaving. Samuel Crowfeather studied the assembled group with eyes that had seen decades of conflict and survival. His gaze lingered on each face, cataloging details that would be remembered later if testimony became necessary. When he spoke, his English was precise despite the slight accent that marked it as a learned rather than native tongue. I am Samuel Crowfeather, tribal elder and registered interpreter for the territorial government, he said formally. I witnessed these men threatening my nephew and his guest on legally owned property. Such behavior violates territorial law regarding harassment and intimidation. The introduction transformed the situation completely. Samuel was not just Joseph's uncle, he was an official representative of the Apache community with legal standing in white courts. His presence meant that any violence would be documented and reported through official channels, creating complications that men like Murphy and Hartwell preferred to avoid.
Hartwell's expression went through several rapid changes as he calculated the new circumstances. Violence against Joseph alone might be overlooked or dismissed by territorial authorities, but violence witnessed by a tribal elder with official status would require investigation and documentation. "We're not threatening anyone," Hartwell said carefully. "We're discussing property boundaries and community standards." Samuel's smile held no warmth. "Ah yes, property boundaries. Perhaps you gentlemen would like to examine the official survey records. I have copies in my possession, including the original territorial survey from 1877 and the updated boundary markers installed in 1882, all clearly showing that this land belongs to Joseph Whitehawk without dispute." The revelation that Samuel possessed legal documentation deflated Murphy's aggressive posture like air escaping from a punctured bladder. His manufactured property dispute had just been revealed as fiction, leaving him without even a pretense of legal justification for his presence. But Hartwell was not so easily deterred. "The question isn't just about legal ownership," he said, his tone shifting to something that might have been reasonable concern. "It's about community standards, about behavior that affects everyone's reputation and safety." His gaze moved meaningfully between Joseph and Rebecca, making his implications clear. He was suggesting that their association represented some kind of moral threat to the community, that proper citizens had a duty to intervene in such situations. "What behavior concerns you specifically, Mr. Hartwell?" Samuel asked with deceptive mildness. "A young woman visiting a ranch to discuss farming techniques, a landowner showing hospitality to a guest. Perhaps you could explain what community standard prohibits such activities." The questions were posed with lawyerly precision, forcing Hartwell to either make his prejudices explicit or abandon his attack entirely. Rebecca realized that Samuel Crowfeather was not just Joseph's uncle. He was a skilled advocate who understood exactly how to use white man's law against white man's bigotry. Hartwell's jaw worked silently as he struggled to find words that would justify his position without revealing its ugly foundation. The desert wind rustled through the sagebrush, carrying the scent of distant rain and the promise of storms yet to come. "Some associations," Hartwell said finally, "are inappropriate regardless of their stated purpose. A respectable woman doesn't visit a man's ranch unaccompanied, especially when that man's reputation in the community is questionable." "Questionable? How?" Samuel pressed relentlessly. "My nephew owns property legally purchased with honestly earned money. He pays taxes, obeys laws, contributes to the community. What exactly makes his reputation questionable?" The trap was perfectly laid. Hartwell could not answer without acknowledging that his objections were based entirely on racial prejudice. But remaining silent would concede Samuel's point that his accusations lacked substance. Rebecca watched the interplay with growing admiration for Samuel's tactical skills. He was dismantling Hartwell's position systematically, using logic and legal precedent to expose the irrationality of racial hatred. It was a masterful performance that revealed both intelligence and long experience in dealing with such situations. Murphy, less sophisticated than Hartwell in his bigotry, provided the answer his employer was too clever to voice directly. "Questionable cause he's Apache, old man. Questionable cause his kind can't be trusted around white women." The words fell into the desert silence like stones into still water, creating ripples of reaction that spread outward from their impact. Murphy had said what everyone was thinking, but no one wanted to acknowledge that this confrontation was ultimately about the supposed threat that Indian men posed to white women's virtue. Samuel nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had succeeded in forcing his opponents to reveal their true nature. There we have it, the real objection. Not property disputes, not community standards, but the ancient fear that drives men to violence when they feel their supposed superiority challenged. He turned to face Rebecca directly, his weathered features serious but kind. "Miss Thompson, you have shown courage in defending my nephew against unjust accusations. But courage sometimes carries a price. These men will not forget your words here today." Rebecca met his gaze steadily, understanding the warning implicit in his words. By standing with Joseph she had made enemies who would seek opportunities for revenge. Her position in Copper Falls, already precarious, would become even more difficult. "I understand," she said quietly, "but I won't apologize for recognizing worth where I find it." Samuel's smile was genuine this time, filled with approval for her stubborn integrity. "Then you understand what it means to live with honor instead of convenience." Joseph had remained silent during the exchange between his uncle and their unwelcome visitors, but now he stepped forward with quiet determination. "Gentlemen, you've stated your concerns and heard our responses. This is private property, and you're no longer welcome here. I suggest you leave before the situation becomes more complicated." The dismissal was polite but final, carrying the unmistakable weight of a man prepared to enforce his words with action if necessary. Murphy's hand moved instinctively toward his gun, but Hartwell caught his arm with a sharp gesture. "This isn't over," Hartwell said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "There are consequences for making the wrong choices, for both of you." "Threats witnessed," Samuel observed calmly. "Noted for future reference should any harm come to my nephew or his guest." The legal implications of Samuel's statement were clear to everyone present. Any violence against Joseph or Rebecca would be investigated with the assumption that Hartwell and his companions were responsible. The protection was not absolute, but it created complications that might deter casual brutality. Hartwell mounted his horse with stiff dignity, his expensive clothes and polished manner no longer seeming quite so impressive after his moral bankruptcy had been exposed. Murphy and his companions followed suit, their aggressive bluster replaced by sullen resentment at being outmaneuvered by their supposed inferiors. "Remember what I said about choosing the right associations, Miss Thompson," Hartwell called as he gathered his reins. "Some mistakes can't be undone." Then they were riding away, dust rising behind their horses like smoke from a departing fire. Rebecca watched until they disappeared over the ridge that marked the boundary of Joseph's property, then turned to find both men studying her with expressions that mixed admiration and concern. "You didn't have to do that," Joseph said quietly. "Standing up to them the way you did, it will make things harder for you in town." Rebecca brushed dust from her skirts, surprised by how calm she felt despite the magnitude of what had just occurred. "Maybe, but I'm tired of being afraid. Tired of letting other people decide what I'm worth." Samuel approached her with the measured pace of someone used to evaluating character under pressure. "You have spirit, Miss Thompson, spirit and principle. These are valuable qualities, but they can also be dangerous in the wrong circumstances." "What kind of circumstances?" she asked. "The kind where men like Hartwell have money and influence while people like Joseph and myself have only the law to protect us. And sometimes the law is not enough." Samuel's expression grew grave. "You have made enemies today who will not forget or forgive. They will look for opportunities to cause trouble, to make you regret your choices." Rebecca nodded, accepting the reality of her situation. "Then I'll have to be careful. But I won't pretend to respect people who don't deserve it, and I won't abandon friends who do." Joseph's smile at her words was warm as desert sunshine. "Friends. I like the sound of that." Samuel studied them both for a long moment, then nodded with apparent satisfaction. "Friends are precious things, especially friends who will stand together when standing alone would be easier." He turned to Joseph. "Nephew, perhaps Miss Thompson would like to see the traditional crop areas before she returns to town. The three sisters planting might interest someone with her knowledge." The suggestion carried subtle weight, indicating Samuel's approval of Rebecca's character while also providing an opportunity for private conversation between the older man and his nephew. Rebecca understood the dynamics and accepted gracefully. "I'd be very interested in seeing traditional planting methods," she said, "especially techniques that have been proven effective in this climate over long periods." As they walked toward the section of the ranch where Joseph grew traditional Apache crops, Rebecca found herself thinking about the confrontation they had just survived. She had crossed a line today, had publicly aligned herself with someone the community's power structure considered unacceptable. The decision felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating, like stepping off a cliff and discovering she could fly. The three sisters' corn, beans, and squash grew together in carefully planned arrangements that maximized the benefit each plant provided to the others. The corn stalks provided support for climbing bean vines, while the beans fixed nitrogen in the soil that fed all three crops. The broad squash leaves shaded the ground, conserving moisture and preventing weeds. "It's ingenious," Rebecca said, studying the intricate relationships between the different plants. "Sustainable, efficient, perfectly adapted to local conditions." "How long have people been farming this way here?" "Generations beyond counting," Joseph replied. "My grandmother's grandmother knew these methods, and her grandmother before her. Knowledge passed down through families, tested by time and survival." Rebecca knelt to examine the soil around the three sisters' planting, noting its rich texture and healthy color. "The soil here is better than in your experimental plots. More organic matter, better water retention. Maria's doing. She prepares this soil the old way, with traditional amendments and blessing ceremonies. Says the plants grow better when the land is properly honored." Joseph's tone carried no mockery, only respect for wisdom he didn't fully understand, but had learned to value. They moved through the traditional planting areas slowly, Joseph explaining the seasonal cycle of cultivation, harvest, and soil restoration that kept the land productive year after year. Rebecca found herself taking mental notes, recognizing techniques that could be adapted for her own future farming efforts. "Joseph," she said as they walked between rows of
drought-tolerant beans, "what happens now? After what happened today? I mean." He was quiet for several steps, considering the question seriously. "Hartwell will cause trouble when he can. Maybe try to interfere with my water rights. Maybe spread stories about my character, or yours. Murphy and his friends might try more direct approaches, if they think they can get away with it. And you're not worried?" Joseph's smile was grim but determined. "Worried, yes, but not surprised, and not unprepared. This has been building for months. Today just brought it into the open." They had reached the edge of the cultivated area, where the ranch land gave way to open desert. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in shades of gold and copper that made even the harsh terrain seem beautiful. "Rebecca," Joseph said, using her given name for the first time, "I need you to understand something. What you did today, standing up to those men, defending me when you could have walked away, it meant more than you might realize." She turned to face him, noting how the evening light softened his angular features, while emphasizing the strength in his bearing. "You stood up for me in town when no one else would. Today I simply returned the favor. It's more than that." His dark eyes were serious, searching her face as if memorizing her features. "Most people, when they're forced to choose between safety and principle, choose safety. You chose principle even when it meant making enemies you can't afford to have." Rebecca felt heat rise in her cheeks at the intensity of his gaze. "Maybe I'm just tired of being afraid all the time, tired of letting other people decide what I'm worth. And what do you think you're worth?" The question hung between them like a challenge, requiring her to articulate something she had never been asked to define. Rebecca looked out at the vast landscape surrounding them, thinking of the journey that had brought her to this moment. "I think I'm worth more than William Hartwell thought," she said finally. "I think my knowledge and skills have value, even if they come with dirt under my fingernails. I think I deserve to be judged by my character and abilities, rather than my circumstances or associations." Joseph nodded slowly, his expression showing something that might have been admiration. "I think you're right, and I think anyone who can't see that worth is a fool." They stood in comfortable silence, as the sun continued its descent, both aware that something significant had shifted between them during the day's events. The confrontation with Hartwell and his companions had forced them to declare their allegiance to each other publicly, creating a bond that went beyond simple friendship or professional respect. "I should get you back to town," Joseph said reluctantly. "Mrs. Kellner will worry if you're out after dark, and I don't want to give our enemies more ammunition to use against either of us." Rebecca nodded, understanding the practical wisdom behind his concern. Today's events had already provided plenty of gossip for Copper Falls, Returning after nightfall would only add fuel to the fire. As they walked back toward the horses, Rebecca found herself thinking about the choice she had made. By standing with Joseph against Hartwell's accusations, she had burned bridges she might never be able to rebuild. Her position in the community, already precarious, was now openly opposed to the established power structure. But for the first time since arriving in Arizona territory, she felt like she was moving toward something rather than simply away from disappointment. Joseph Whitehawk had seen her value when others saw only shame, had offered respect when others offered only pity or contempt. Standing with him felt like standing with herself, like finally choosing to fight for her own worth rather than accepting others' diminishment. The ride back to Copper Falls passed in thoughtful silence, both riders aware that they were returning to a community where the dynamics had shifted in ways that could not be undone. The confrontation at the ranch had drawn clear battle lines, creating allies and enemies that would shape all future interactions. As the lights of town appeared in the distance, Rebecca realized that she was no longer the same woman who had stepped off the train just days earlier. That woman had been seeking acceptance, hoping to find a place where she could belong without having to defend her worth. This woman riding beside Joseph Whitehawk was prepared to fight for her principles, to stand with people who deserved her loyalty regardless of the personal cost. The transformation felt as significant as any religious conversion, a fundamental shift in how she understood herself and her place in the world. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new tests of the resolve she had discovered today. But tonight, riding through the desert darkness beside a man who had shown her what respect looked like, Rebecca Thompson felt stronger than she had in years. The stars were beginning to appear overhead, brilliant points of light in the clear desert sky. Rebecca looked up at them and felt something like hope stirring in her chest. The future remained uncertain, filled with dangers and difficulties she was only beginning to understand. But it was her future now, shaped by her own choices rather than others' expectations. That realization was worth whatever price she might have to pay for it. Word traveled fast in Copper Falls. By the time Rebecca and Joseph reached town, news of their confrontation with William Hartwell had spread through every saloon and boarding house. Rebecca felt watching eyes as they rode down Main Street, conversations stopping as people turned to stare at the woman who had publicly chosen sides in a conflict everyone knew would have lasting consequences. Mrs. Kellner waited on the boarding house porch, arms crossed. She watched Joseph help Rebecca dismount, noting the careful distance he maintained despite the obvious connection between them. "Evening, Martha," Joseph said quietly. "Brought Miss Thompson back safe as promised." "Joseph," Mrs. Kellner's voice carried layers of meaning. "Heard you had some excitement out at your place today." "Nothing we couldn't handle." His response was deliberately casual, but Rebecca caught the underlying tension. Inside the empty parlor, Mrs. Kellner lit an additional lamp and settled into her chair, studying them both with intensity. "Sheriff Crawford came by about an hour ago," she began without preamble. "William Hartwell stopped at his office, making accusations about threats and harassment." Rebecca's stomach tightened. "What kind of accusations?" "The usual nonsense. Claims you threatened him, Joseph, that you're harboring dangerous attitudes toward white settlers, that your association with Miss Thompson represents some threat to community safety." Mrs. Kellner's tone made clear what she thought of such charges. "Crawford's not fool enough to believe it, but he's not stupid enough to ignore complaints from someone with Hartwell's connections." Joseph recounted the confrontation with quiet precision, leaving out nothing but adding no emotional coloring. When he finished, Mrs. Kellner sat in thoughtful silence. "You did the right thing," she said finally, looking directly at Rebecca. "Standing up to bullies, defending what's decent. But doing the right thing doesn't always protect you from consequences." "What kind of consequences?" Rebecca asked. "For you, loss of employment opportunities, social isolation, maybe harassment from Hartwell's associates. For Joseph, could be much worse. Property damage, violence, pressure from territorial authorities." The reality settled over them like dust after a windstorm. Rebecca had known there would be repercussions, but hearing them spelled out made the danger feel immediate. "I won't apologize for defending Joseph's character," she said firmly. Mrs. Kellner smiled at her integrity. "Didn't expect you would. Takes real strength to stick by convictions when the cost gets high." 3 days later, Sheriff Crawford came to question Rebecca. He was a man of moderate politics, more interested in maintaining order than pursuing justice when they conflicted, but fundamentally honest. "Miss Thompson, I need to ask about what happened at the White Hawk place." Rebecca poured coffee, using the ritual to calm her nerves. "Of course, Sheriff." Crawford consulted his notebook. "William Hartwell claims Joseph Whitehawk threatened him, that aggressive language was used, that you were present under questionable circumstances." "I was visiting to discuss agricultural techniques," Rebecca said clearly. "Mr. Whitehawk's methods for desert farming are innovative. At no point did he threaten violence or use inflammatory language." Crawford made careful notes. "What about you?" "Hartwell claims you made disrespectful statements, sided with Whitehawk against legitimate community concerns." "I defended Mr. Whitehawk against unjust accusations based on prejudice rather than facts. I expressed my opinion that a man should be judged by character and accomplishments rather than ancestry." Crawford studied her, apparently trying to reconcile her composed dignity with Hartwell's portrayal. Finally, he closed his notebook. "Miss Thompson, I've known Joseph Whitehawk 8 years. Never given me trouble. Always respectful. Pays his taxes. Minds his business. I've dealt with Hartwell's complaints more times than I care to count." He paused carefully. "Based on what I know about both men's characters, I believe your version." Relief flooded through Rebecca. "That said, you need to understand this isn't really about what happened at the ranch. It's about social boundaries, about who belongs where and with whom. Those aren't legal questions, but they can become legal problems fast if people don't exercise good judgment." Rebecca understood the warning. Crawford couldn't protect her from social and economic consequences of her choices. That evening, Joseph came for dinner, his timing calculated to seem most natural. After other diners retired, Mrs. Kellner left them alone in the parlor. "Sheriff Crawford came to see me," Rebecca said without preamble. Joseph nodded, unsurprised. "What did he want?" "Details about your ranch. Hartwell's version versus actual facts." She paused. "He believes our account, but he's worried about where this is heading." "Worried how?" "About social consequences of our association. About potential violence from people who disapprove of relationships crossing racial boundaries." Joseph was quiet, his dark eyes reflecting unreadable thoughts. "Rebecca, you need to understand something. If you choose to continue associating with me, if our relationship develops beyond friendship, there will be consequences. Real ones. Some people will never accept you back into conventional society. And if I choose not to continue, if I step back now, then you might rebuild your position, find employment, maybe attract another marriage proposal from someone willing to overlook your temporary lapse in judgment." His tone was carefully neutral. "You still have choices, Rebecca, but not for much longer." Rebecca walked to the window, looking at scattered lights marking ordinary lives, governed by conventional expectations. She thought about the safety of conformity, the security of accepting assigned roles. Then she thought about intellectual stimulation of conversations with Joseph, the respect in his eyes, the sense of partnership that had developed despite every obstacle. "Joseph, what do you want? Not what's practical or safe, but what do you actually want?" She heard him move closer. "I want you to stay. I want to continue the conversations we've started, explore the possibilities we've discovered. I want to build something together that honors both our strengths." He paused. "I want to wake up every morning with someone who sees my worth instead of my ancestry. Someone whose intelligence challenges me to be better." Rebecca closed her eyes, feeling the pull of everything he offered. "And you understand what you're asking. The price we'd both pay. I understand. The question is whether you think it's worth paying." She turned to face him, noting how lamplight emphasized the strength in his features. This was the man who had defended her when no one else would, who had recognized her value when others saw shame. Yes, she said simply. I think it's worth paying. Joseph's smile transformed his face like sunrise over desert. Rebecca Thompson, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Would you help me build a life based on partnership and mutual respect rather than convention? The proposal was everything she had never known she wanted. Yes, she whispered. Yes, I will marry you. His hands cupped her face gently as he leaned down to kiss her with reverence of someone who understood how precious the moment was. The kiss was gentle but certain, a promise of partnership through whatever challenges lay ahead. Mrs. Kellner chose that moment to return, her timing so perfect Rebecca suspected she'd been listening. About time, she said. I was beginning to wonder if you two were going to dance around each other until the desert froze over. Martha, we'd like your blessing and advice about how to proceed. You have my blessing. As for advice, get married quickly and quietly. Don't give your enemies time to organize opposition. Samuel Crowfeather can perform the ceremony under tribal law, which the territory recognizes. When? Rebecca asked. Tomorrow, Joseph said without hesitation. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Rebecca dressed in her best dress, the same one she'd worn to meet William Hartwell, but now it felt like armor rather than disguise. Joseph arrived precisely at noon with Samuel Crowfeather and Maria. Samuel was dressed formally, his bearing dignified. Maria brought wild flowers from the desert, simple blooms more appropriate than elaborate arrangements for a ceremony celebrating authenticity. The wedding party was small but complete. Mrs. Kellner served as Rebecca's witness while Samuel performed the ceremony binding them under both tribal and territorial law. Do you, Joseph Whitehawk, take Rebecca Thompson as your wife, to honor her intelligence, support her dreams, and stand with her against whatever challenges you may face? I do. Do you, Rebecca Thompson, take Joseph Whitehawk as your husband, to respect his character, share his struggles and build with him a life based on love rather than convention? I do. Samuel pronounced them married with authority vested in him by both the Apache Nation and Arizona Territory. Joseph's kiss was tender but certain, sealing promises building between them since their first meeting. As they prepared to leave for Joseph's ranch, Mrs. Kellner pressed a small package into Rebecca's hands. Inside was the seed packet from Kansas, carefully preserved. Plant these in your new garden, she said, something from your past to grow in your future. The ride to Joseph's ranch felt different this time, transformed by knowledge that she was going home rather than visiting. Rebecca rode beside her husband through landscape becoming familiar, ready to build the life they had chosen together despite every obstacle. At the ranch, Maria had prepared a simple wedding feast, traditional Apache foods mixed with familiar dishes that reminded Rebecca of home. Samuel offered blessings in 3 languages, acknowledging the complexity of their union while celebrating its foundation in mutual respect and genuine affection. As evening settled over the valley, Rebecca and Joseph stood on the porch of what was now their shared home, watching stars emerge in the clear desert sky. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with plans unspoken but understood. What will tomorrow bring? Rebecca asked softly. Joseph's arm tightened around her waist. Work. The same challenges we faced yesterday, but we'll face them together now. There's still Hartwell to deal with, still people who'll disapprove of our choice. But there's also crops to tend, irrigation systems to improve, a future to build. Rebecca thought about the seeds Mrs. Kellner had given her, about planting something from her Kansas past in this Arizona soil. The metaphor felt perfect for their entire situation, taking what was valuable from old circumstances and nurturing it in new ground. The first months of their marriage tested both their resolve and their partnership. Hartwell made good on his threats, using his influence to make business difficult for Joseph. Several merchants refused to deal with him, water rights were challenged through territorial courts, and mysterious problems plagued his irrigation systems. But for every door that closed, another opened. Mexican and Apache family, recognizing Rebecca's practical skills and Joseph's fair dealings, brought business that replaced what was lost. Her knowledge of crop rotation and soil management helped neighboring small farmers improve their yields,
creating a network of mutual support that proved more valuable than Hartwell's grudging tolerance. Rebecca adapted to desert life with surprising ease. The harsh beauty of the landscape spoke to something in her spirit that had been dormant during her years of struggle in Kansas. She learned to read weather patterns in cloud formations, to find water by observing where certain plants clustered, to time planting by subtle changes in day length and temperature. Her marriage to Joseph deepened into something neither had fully anticipated. Their partnership extended beyond romantic affection into genuine collaboration, each bringing skills and perspectives that enhanced the other's capabilities. Joseph's systematic approach to experimentation complemented Rebecca's intuitive understanding of plant behavior. Her knowledge of traditional farming techniques from the Midwest blended seamlessly with his understanding of desert agriculture. By their first anniversary, the ranch had become a model of innovative farming adapted to harsh conditions. Visitors came from across the territory to observe their methods, to learn about water conservation and crop selection. Rebecca found herself consulted as an expert, her opinion sought by people who would have dismissed her a year earlier. The transformation extended beyond professional recognition. The community's attitude toward their marriage gradually shifted from hostility to grudging acceptance to something approaching respect. Not everyone approved, but most came to acknowledge that their partnership produced results that benefited the broader region. William Hartwell eventually found other targets for his attention, his efforts to destroy Joseph's reputation having failed so completely that continuing them only highlighted his own petty vindictiveness. Adelaide Hartwell maintained her social superiority by pretending Rebecca no longer existed, a willful blindness that suited both women perfectly. Mrs. Kellner remained a frequent visitor, taking obvious satisfaction in the success of a match she had encouraged from the beginning. Samuel Crowfeather became not just family but trusted advisor, his wisdom helping them navigate the complex politics of a territory where multiple cultures struggled to find common ground. On warm evenings, Rebecca and Joseph would sit on their porch watching the stars emerge over their valley. Sometimes they spoke of the future, of children who might inherit both their determination and their understanding that worth came from character rather than circumstances. Sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, simply grateful for the unexpected gift of finding genuine partnership in a world that seemed designed to prevent such connections. Rebecca often thought about the train that had brought her to Copper Falls, about the desperate woman who had stepped onto that platform with nothing but hopes based on false promises. That woman had been seeking security through conventional means, hoping to find acceptance by conforming to others' expectations. The woman she had become understood that true security came from building something authentic with someone who valued her actual self rather than a carefully constructed facade. The journey from one understanding to the other had been difficult, marked by humiliation and rejection and the constant threat of social ostracism. But it had also been transformative, revealing strengths she hadn't known she possessed and possibilities she had never dared to imagine. Standing with Joseph against community pressure had taught her that dignity could not be granted by others. It could only be claimed and defended by the person who possessed it. Their love story became local legend, told and retold in variations that emphasized different aspects of their courage, their stubborn integrity, their refusal to accept limitations imposed by small minds and smaller hearts. Some versions focused on romance, others on social justice, still others on the practical benefits of combining different knowledge traditions. But the truth was simpler and more complex than any single telling could capture. Rebecca Thompson had come to Arizona territory as a failed mail-order bride, rejected for being exactly what she was proud to be. Joseph Whitehawk had been a successful rancher marginalized by prejudice, his accomplishments diminished by others' inability to see past his ancestry. Together they had built something that honored both their backgrounds while transcending the limitations others tried to impose. Their marriage became proof that authentic partnership could overcome social obstacles, that mutual respect could create foundations strong enough to support dreams neither had imagined possible alone. The desert wind carried scents of sage and possibility, and Rebecca Thompson Whitehawk felt stronger than she had in years. The future remained uncertain, but it was theirs now, shaped by their own choices rather than others' expectations. In choosing each other, they had chosen to live by their own values rather than others' prejudices. And that choice had made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.